One thing I think we've neglected as an industry is to talk more to the planners and spend more time with them so they can understand what's going on. They often just have a very vague idea about what a microgrid is, if they have any idea at all. So I think a lot of education on that side of things would really help tremendously.
The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more. Hey guys, are you a residential solar installer doing light commercial but wanting to scale into large C&I solar? I'm Tim Montague. I've developed over 150 megawatts of commercial solar, and I've solved the problem that you're having. You don't know what tools and technologies you need in order to successfully close 100 kW to megawatt scale projects. I've developed a commercial solar accelerator to help installers exactly like you. Just go to cleanpowerhour.com, click on strategy, and book a call today. It's totally free with no obligation. Thanks for being a listener. I really appreciate you listening to the pod. And I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Go to Clean Power Hour and click strategy today. Thanks so much.
The clean energy industry is moving fast. The deals are getting bigger, the technology is evolving, and the stakes have never been higher. Welcome to the Clean Power Hour, the podcast for solar, storage, and microgrid professionals who want to stay ahead of it all. Each week, your host, Tim Montague, industry advisor and president of Clean Power Consulting Group, brings you unfiltered conversations with the leaders actually building the energy transition. Now, here's your host, Tim Montague.
Today on the Clean Power Hour, my guest is Elisa Wood. She is an award-winning writer, editor, and podcast host with more than 30 years covering power markets, grid innovation, and the energy transition. She is the founder of EnergyChangemakers.com. Previously, she co-founded Microgrid Knowledge and RealEnergyWriters.com, establishing herself as a leading voice in microgrids, distributed energy resources, and grid modernization. She hosts the Energy Changemakers Podcast, a semi-weekly show featuring in-depth conversations with industry leaders on DERs, virtual power plants, and microgrids, and the path to a decentralized grid. Welcome to the show, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be here.
I really am honored to have you on the show, and I'm so excited to geek out on what I think is the most important aspect of the energy transition, to be quite frank, and that is community energy or community microgrids. So it's really great to have you. You are the closest to this kind of an expert, I think, as I've come so far on this journey. So before we get into the topic du jour, give our listeners a little taste, though, of what was the spark for you that got you so interested in renewable energy and microgrids back in the day?
Yeah, so I've been writing about energy for over 30 years. I kind of covered all the early wars between utilities and independent power plants and the road towards competition. And early on, when the states were beginning to restructure and allow a certain amount of competition to utilities, I noticed that there was a green energy advocate very involved in some of the proceedings before the state, for the state of Massachusetts in particular. And I said, why are you here? The others are like these companies that are building gas-fired power plants and stuff, and you're an environmentalist. Why are you here? And he said, because when we start to open these markets, we're going to start to open the way to innovation. And then we're going to start to see an explosion of solar and other renewables and other innovations. So, this was quite a while ago, probably around early 2000s. And I think what he said has come to bear. I think at least in part, we're seeing so much innovation, have seen so much innovation in the last, 10, 15 years, because of those early moves to open up some competition to the utilities. What happened next for me, one of my big changes was Superstorm Sandy. I was covering that. I was working at that time for a couple of different publications, S&P Global and Renewable Energy World. I was in Washington, D.C., and a lot of those writers were in New England and New York. So the publications were desperate for copy. And I was like getting up at 6 a.m. and working until midnight writing stories for them at that time because the other writers couldn't get online. Everybody was knocked off power from Superstorm Sandy. And that's when I first started hearing about microgrids because, I remember being in on these press conferences with officials from New York City. And some people were getting on and saying, hey, you know what? There's some buildings that have power. What's going on? How come that building has power? How come that hospital, that school has power and we don't? And they were the early microgrids. And that's kind of where the conversation started, is where my interest began.
Well, that is a great story. The statistic that I love to bring to my listeners is that billion-dollar emergencies, mostly weather-related in the United States, used to be once every 90 days back in the 1980s. And today, they're happening every 19 days. So the weather is definitely changing. And even here in the spring, where I live in Illinois, we see warmer weather earlier and we see warmer weather later. And in general, the winters are milder. And we still have this seesaw. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, it was 80 degrees. And then today, it's 40 degrees. It was 30 degrees when I was playing pickleball this morning. Crazy swings. But generally, it's getting warmer. Armadillos are migrating into southern Illinois. They used to only exist in the far south, and now we have armadillos in southern Illinois, literally.
Incredible.
And nature doesn't lie. Like, there's a reason. They like warm weather. So anyway.
Yeah. I was at my farmer's market a couple of weeks ago, and it was like 80 degrees. People were in shorts, but there was still piles of snow on the ground because we had a snowstorm, and then it turned 80. It was like bizarre,
Yeah. Weather is weird. All right. So we have this thing called the grid, which is an amazing machine. Some people say it's the most complicated machine that humanity has ever built. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but it's an amazing machine. And I'm super grateful for the grid that we have in the US. It's very reliable. It is still relatively dirty, run on a lot of fossil fuels, mostly natural gas now, not so much coal, but we're in the transition from coal and gas and nuclear to solar, wind, and batteries. We've achieved in solar, wind, and batteries, around 10% of our grid is clean power. And we're going to go to an 80% or a 90% solar and wind powered grid sometime around 2050, give or take a decade. And, that's just because of the economics, right? If you're a grid operator, you want to make investments in infrastructure that makes good financial sense to your investors. And wind, solar, and batteries are that technology today. But there is a problem. When the grid goes down, we don't generally have a system of self-repair or microgridding at scale. Sure, some campuses, hospitals, community centers do have microgrid infrastructure to isolate from the grid when the greater grid goes down. And you were referring to some of those organizations in your introduction. But what's possible is for communities, tens of thousands of people, to be on a microgrid that can microgrid from the greater grid when the greater grid goes down. And Craig Lewis is the person who really planted this seed for me at the Clean Coalition. I know you know Craig. But I find that when I talk with my energy colleagues about community scale microgrids, I often get a bit of a blank stare. It's as if they really just haven't thought too much about it. We're used to thinking really about nanogrids, building scale microgrids, or campus scale microgrids, but not community scale, where I could have the whole city of Champaign, for example, on a microgrid if there was a regional outage, which there was about 20 years ago, We had a 5-day outage. It predates my residency here in the community. I moved here 18 years ago. Tell us big picture, and then let's get into some examples of where this is working, because this is vital for energy professionals to understand, is that there are some great case studies now across the United States, both West Coast and East Coast and Midwest. What is your big picture take on this phenomenon? I'm going to continue to call it community scale microgrids. You call it community power, I think. Set the table for us, if you would.
Yeah. So I sometimes use the word community energy, and that encompasses more than microgrids. That would include, for instance, community solar or other kinds of community energy that are used. But a microgrid is something very specific, a community microgrid, because what's different, and you alluded to this, is that it can island from the main grid during a power outage. So it senses the grid's about to go down, it islands, it kicks on its on-site generators, and your fire station, your grocery store, your whatever's hooked up to the microgrid keeps running while the rest of the grid is down. And then when the grid comes back, you can reattach again. So that's a true microgrid. And the toughest ones to build have been the community microgrids. We saw a lot of commercial and industrial microgrids built because, a manufacturer has a very clear sense of, if I lose power, I lose this much money because I can't put out this many widgets or whatever. But it's more fuzzy, right, with the community microgrid, because when you're trying to make an economic case, there's not commerce, there's not a production line that you can point to. But of course, there's a whole lot of disruption and a whole lot of economic hardship when you have a power outage. But again, it's more murky, harder to make the case. That's one of the reasons you don't see as many community microgrids as you see other kinds of microgrids. Again, commercial industrial facilities have put a lot in. Data centers are putting them in like crazy now. Hospitals, universities, any kind of critical facility, they look seriously at microgrids. So communities, it's a whole kind of different story, right? One problem is that, like I said, trying to make the economic argument, not that it's not there, it's just difficult to make. The other thing is, communities don't really know how to do this. I've heard from so many communities over the years saying, this is a great idea. How do I do it? Well, honestly, it's really hard to do if you're a community on your own. You really got to go find somebody in the business. You've got to find someone who builds microgrids, and work with them, because it's a whole different kind of energy that you're not used to. So that's kind of gotten in the way. But I've seen some really interesting trends recently that have increased the push towards community microgrids. And one is always resilience. Like you talked about, the weather's bad, wildfires, all these things make people look at microgrids. But another is there's a push, and a lot of people on my media platform tend to talk about this, a push towards more energy democracy, meaning that more of the energy wealth stays with the community. So as opposed to, buying your power from a big utility or something along those lines, you are keeping the generation local, you're keeping the jobs local, you've got control over it. So that's kind of another impetus, I think, that kind of desire to carve out and keep the energy local. Yeah, there haven't been massive amounts of them, but there have been attempts by state governments to get them moving, which has been encouraging. Some have been successful to some degree, and some of the early ones weren't. We're seeing microgrids being built in California as a result of the California's program. There was an early attempt by New York called the New York Prize to get microgrids going. That wasn't very successful in and of itself in terms of getting a lot of microgrids built, but it was kind of a sandbox for the rest of the community, the rest of the microgrid industry throughout the United States to learn more about this technology. It was one of the very early programs. And then the state of Massachusetts is a third one I'd point to that has a very traditional kind of, we'll give you a grant, this will help this community build a microgrid, we'll give you a grant to do it. And they've had some success with that as well. But it's honestly been slow moving, which is a shame because you know what it's like when you have a power outage. And most of these microgrids tend to start someplace, some sort of critical facility. Like you don't want to lose your water, right? You don't want to lose your fire department. You don't want to lose your police station. So that's where they tend to go. And there's a really interesting group of community microgrids in Montgomery County, Maryland. They have really done some very interesting microgrid development there. I would say they're probably ahead of almost everybody else in the country right now, but I'll get into that a little later on when I'm talking about my favorite
Sure.
microgrids.
So I need to reference Craig's work again because he's done a couple of things that I think are very important. One, he created a framework called VOR, Value of Resiliency, which just helps you prioritize and value resiliency, right? And it breaks down kind of, okay, is this mission critical? Is this life-saving technology or facilities like first responders? You want them to be valued at X, the standard everyday facility. And then there's 2X, which is important but less than life-saving, say a community center or something like that. And then there's everyone else. But he also makes the point that utilities actually can like this kind of infrastructure. They traditionally want to build transmission and distribution. They have a cost plus business model. So building infrastructure is in their DNA. They want to build stuff because that's what generates profit. So Craig flips it on the head and says, that model on the head, and says, look, we want you to build infrastructure. We want you to build solar batteries or solar wind and batteries and the switchgear to microgrid, and thereby give the community resiliency and reduce the need for additional transmission and distribution. And they still get to build infrastructure. And then you get infrastructure plus in that's what I call it, infrastructure that has a level of resiliency, which is above and beyond the ordinary grid. And this just makes a lot of sense to me. The other backdrop for me is that we invented the grid and we empowered the utilities, right, to bring electricity to everybody in America virtually, right? We got rural electrification back in the 20s, and it was an amazing initiative, and it totally radically changed the quality of life for rural Americans. Imagine not having electricity and living in a rural place, right? And then having electricity. I mean, it's a total game changer. We're now beholden to the utilities in ways that are very uncomfortable. They have a model that is very stodgy. It does not change easily. And the world has changed. The technology has changed, and our expectations for the utilities has changed. And so somehow we need to reinvent that system that is there for us. But seemingly Americans are servants to the grid operators in so many places. And you see this butting of heads between energy transition professionals and grid operators in many, many markets, to the point where there's quite a bit of animosity sometimes in markets like California. The person who is very vociferous about this is Barry Cinnamon, for example, of Cinnamon Energy. Mm-hmm. And I love Barry, and check out the Energy Show. It's a fantastic podcast, and he's a great solar, residential and commercial solar and battery installer, and an OG in the industry. And we stand on his shoulders. But so I'm curious in this conversation, Alisa, if we can kind of dig into some nooks and crannies that give us points of light to a better way of rebuilding this machine. We have the machine, and now we need to build a version 2.0 of the machine that embodies resilience at all scales, from the micro to the macro.
Well, you're getting to the heart of the problem here, right? It's that there's this push and pull between utilities and the new technologies, including microgrids. The utilities see them as competition. They have definitely at times tried to block their progress. It's been a funny relationship between the microgrid community and utilities. It's hard to define, of course, there's 3,000 utilities. So it's always hard to say the utilities are doing this, the utilities are doing that, because you have different utilities doing different things. But we've seen utilities that wanted to build microgrids and regulators wouldn't let them. In a restructured state, for example, they wouldn't let them. They said, no, this is something to keep with the competitive market. And then we see utilities that don't want anybody building microgrids. They try to block them, and various things in between. No easy answer here about how to solve this. I think that the competitive states, the Northeast, California have done a better job at being able to get microgrids built than the states where the utilities are vertically integrated. But yeah, how do you do that? I mean, do you give this is the debate that goes on all the time, right? How do you give the utility an incentive to build the microgrids? Is that really a good idea? There's people who say it's a terrible idea because although although they have built microgrids, we've noticed that they tend to be built very slowly. As you said earlier, they're not utilities aren't really. It's not in their DNA to take on innovative projects. Things happen very, very slowly. While the private sector's been out there building microgrids like crazy. You'll get one pilot project out of a utility, and you'll get dozens of independent projects going. So there's no easy answer to how to resolve this block. I wish I had it.
For sure. The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more. Well, let's talk about some examples, some case studies where communities have created breakthroughs. It takes a combination of stakeholders. The little that I know of this, catalysts, like microgrid developers or microgrid consulting firms like Clean Coalition. And of course, there's community stakeholders. These are elected officials. There's the grid operators themselves, some of them more innovative than others. And then others in the industry like you and I. There's all kinds of stakeholders. But what are some stories? And I guess if there's a pattern that you see, a recipe, I would love to know what the recipe is.
Well, I'd say if there could be a recipe, it would be give the utilities some kind of financial stake in this. The problem, we rail against the utilities a lot, but the truth be told, their business model prohibits them from liking something like a microgrid, right? Because they do not, like you said before, they don't make profit on that. They make profit on building transmission and distribution and power generation. So we've set up this weird system where we're saying to the utilities, you should like this, but we're not going to give you any reason to like it. It's not going to help your business model. So short of doing away with the whole utility monopoly, business structure, I think that's where we have to look at it. We have to look at, what kind of incentive can we give them to like this, to want this, so that they're not getting in the way. But yeah, there have been a lot of also states that have tried to boost the industry in various ways through grants and whatnot. You mentioned value of resilience. New York spent a lot of time working on valuing resilience as part of its reforming the energy vision program a few years back. And, that was meant to try to, help boost these industries, which here's the irony about a microgrid, right? It does this thing. It creates resilience. It's a true thing. It keeps the power on for a community, a hospital, a business, whatever, but it's not paid for that in any way. There's no value to that. There's no monetary value given to that service. It just does it, right? So that's one of the big kind of issues that the industry grapples with, that they've got this service, but nothing in the system values that. So the states have tried to get around that by offering these different kinds of incentives. It started, like I said, with New York. They had a program called New York Prize. I can't remember. I think it was I want to say it was 90. I don't remember the exact figure or how much they gave out initially, but they gave out quite a bit of money for people to look at how to develop microgrids. A lot of them are community microgrids. It was very early. Nobody had done it before. They ended up producing a lot of valuable work, but no microgrids. Their work is being used by the industry now, but nothing actually came out of it.
I mean, has somebody made a good definition of what a community microgrid is?
No, that's not really a good definition. It's typically a microgrid that in some way serves a community service. Like I said, it might be a fire station, it might be a hospital, it might be some houses that are around there. We haven't seen a lot of residential community microgrids. We've seen like some houses being included in these traditional community microgrids, but not a lot of, some exceptions are like neighborhoods in Florida and whatnot that have created microgrid-like systems to protect against hurricanes down there. But yeah, coming up with a true definition is a tough one. I mean, typically it's like looked upon as a microgrid that serves a couple of different buildings or services within a community. So it's got a greater good, right? It's got a greater good than the microgrid that is keeping the factory down the street going during a power outage. And the interesting thing too is that they try to site these microgrids, these community microgrids, in places where they will help more than just the fire station, right? They'll try to find like a community center where people can gather to charge their phones, or, maybe there's a food distribution site there, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a traditional community microgrid, right? You've got some way of helping the community, and you're at some facility that's critical. There's also kind of variations on the theme. There's a really interesting organization called the Footprint Project. I don't know if you've heard of them or not.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So they do a kind of community microgrid in the sense that they drive during a disaster, right? They drive their microgrids into a community, and they hook up to, they might go to a church, they might go to a fire station, something where they can provide power so community members can come and get warm food or whatever they need, during that time. So that's kind of that's another variation on the theme of what a community microgrid might be. And then, like I said, you've got these neighborhoods in Florida where it's actually a residential neighborhood. It's a quasi microgrid, really. It's kind of solar storage. Sometimes it's solar storage just on the houses. Sometimes it's a centralized battery that can island from the grid, and so they keep the lights on when there's a storm. So that's another variation on the theme of a community microgrid. And some really fascinating things are going on that kind of take this concept out further. Ithaca, New York just proposed a really fascinating, it's kind of like a community microgrid of microgrids. They basically want to take the whole city of Ithaca and island it from the main grid by building a series of microgrids within the city. So, there might be a microgrid at a university initially, and, that will serve part of a community. And basically they're looking at different ways to hook these microgrids together. It's a very sort of complicated system, and I'm really simplifying it here. We have an article about it over on Energy Changemakers. Just search on Ithaca. It recently won approval from the city council to go forward. So definitely one of the most innovative community microgrids I've ever seen. And then you have another variation on the theme is something like what Ann Arbor, Michigan is doing, where they've created the sustainable utility, and they are, providing solar and storage for homeowners through this utility, as opposed to a traditional utility would provide electricity via centralized power plants. They're providing solar and storage for households instead. So there's all these variations on what a community microgrid is. And it's evolving and changing as all these different models come up. But going back to, you asked me about what's happening in various states. So I started with New York. That was the big one. California, of course, is really interesting. And I'm sure Craig has talked to you a bit about what's happening there. But they gave the utilities funding for community microgrids. It was like $200 million. And there was mixed feelings about this because utilities are slow to develop them. A lot of the private developers did not want utilities to be doing these projects. They wanted the money to be distributed more broadly, but the state kept them with the state. And and they're using a community microgrid tariff approach. So one of the key things and one of the key problems, which we haven't gotten into yet about community microgrids or any microgrids, is what's known as the over the fence rule, which is you cannot, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about this, but you can't send power over a right of way. So if one building's on one side of the road and another building's on another side of the road, you cannot connect those two buildings into a microgrid. Property has to be owned by one entity. So the California Community Microgrid Project is allowing a certain amount of that ability to go over the fence. And that was that was good. We'll see how much it actually happens, but
It seems fundamental. If you're going to do community scale, you've got to get over the fence.
yeah, and it's what stops a lot of community microgrids is you cannot get over the fence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you mentioned some other states, Florida, Maryland. What is
Yeah.
happening in Florida and Maryland?
So Florida, it's not so much a government program. It's simply that these private real estate developers have figured out that it's to their advantage to build neighborhoods that can keep the power on during power outages. So there's some really interesting projects that have been built, interesting neighborhoods. One of them we had on one of our video live streams, and it's called Hunters Point, and it's in Tampa. Some of these are more like virtual power plants than microgrids. I mean, again, everybody uses the term loosely, where they've got batteries. This has got 86 net zero homes. Every home has solar and storage. They're single family. And the houses were built to survive hurricane force winds, and they have. They generate 35% more energy than they consume, and they're virtually tied together with software. So it's kind of a virtual power plant approach.
Sure.
And then there's another one that's a bit more sophisticated in Lakeland, Florida. This one's under construction. And in this case, the homes have solar and storage, but there's also a centralized battery. And so it's kind of almost like an energy park. And they can use that battery for load balancing and grid services. And then the third one, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about because it was in the news a lot, was Babcock Ranch, which isn't really a microgrid, but a large solar field.
Right.
But again, they were able to provide a degree of resilience during storms.
Is there a battery in Babcock?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I imagine there must be.
I mean, solar is only so good, right?
Right.
In a grid outage event. So
yeah, it seems like there must be a battery. I don't know how else they would achieve the resilience.
So in the Tampa case, though, you mentioned that the homes were designed to consume less energy than the solar and battery array for each home. In the case of a grid outage, does that cluster of homes also then provide some electricity for a wider geography?
No, they're just working within their own neighborhood.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's pretty common with most community microgrids at this point in time. There's not a lot going on with a wider geography.
Yeah. I would refer our listeners to A.J. Perkins' work. He's doing something similar in Hawaii, with residential solar and batteries and VPP. And in his case, I think the majority of his work is around third-party ownership of those assets, which I think makes a lot of sense when you're trying to democratize access, right? Low-income people are not going to be able to afford solar and batteries on their homes. You need a leg up in the form of third-party ownership. So in our last few minutes together, though, I guess I'd love to kind of paint a picture for an ideal world. And if there are some elements, we've touched on a few projects. Ann Arbor, Michigan, that is a municipal utility, right, that has integrated resiliency into its model with solar and batteries. I don't know what percentage of the community is truly resilient. And if you know that, I'd love to hear that. But so having municipal utilities is one certainly signal that I see, and it does make it relatively concrete. And then you have a major stakeholder, the city or the town, right, that can make a lot of decisions and muster resources and say, okay, we are going to do this. We're on this journey. That aside, though, if you're just, say a city in an investor-owned utility in the Midwest and you want to do this, you have to bring some additional resources to bear to incentivize the scenario. And I guess that's one of my questions is, well, who is going to inject those resources? Because money talks. What ends up getting built in the built environment has to pencil in some way, shape, or form, either for the government in the case of things like the grid, when we electrified rural America, there was an economic incentive for the government to do this and to jazz the economy. And that really worked, right? You're providing education and economic benefits, and it feeds back positively. With resiliency, it's more you're preventing the fall of productivity in the case of a wide outage in a big storm, say a big hurricane, right? Like Sandy, that was a huge economic loss. You have to rebuild. You're offline. You don't have business continuity. You don't have services for the public, and it's a black eye, right? And it takes a while to come back from that. Several years in the case of a storm like Sandy, right? That was a big, big storm.
Yeah.
And I don't know, has New York gotten more resilient in a post-Sandy world, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. There have been quite a few microgrids built in New York post-Sandy. I mean, there are a lot of, like I said, there are a lot of microgrids being built. It's just the community microgrids that are the tough ones to come by because it's not always clear. Sometimes it is clear. Like sometimes you've seen this happen where you have a water facility, but in particular, it's real clear that what's going to happen if you lose that water facility in the community. And so, there is funding that comes forward for something like that. But yeah, everything has been hit very hard, by the loss of federal funding. There were quite a few community microgrid grants that got put on hold or are out searching for other funding now because they thought they were going to get federal money. So that's put them on hold. California, again, has been, a place where we've seen more microgrids built because there is state money that comes through. Maryland, again, you've got a county there that's very supportive. You got a state that's very supportive. So there are states where you're seeing the support, and that's really all there is right now. There's not a whole lot of federal support for community microgrids. So it's a tough time. It's not impossible. It's happening. We've got some great, like I said, some great microgrid projects out there. One of them I didn't mention, just would love to give a shout out to, is in California, which is the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid. Oh, two of them actually in California. The Redwood Coast Airport microgrid in Humboldt County, and then the Blue Lake Rancheria, also in Humboldt County. I wrote an article once, what is it about Humboldt County? They seem to have a lot of microgrids in Humboldt County, California. But Blue Lake in particular, it is a casino actually, but they made it into a true community microgrid. And when they have had power outages, they just invite the community in. I mean, they have done medical care there. They published the newspaper there so people would still get news during a power outage. They've actually saved lives. I mean, they were inviting people in who had medical equipment that they needed to survive and they had no power to power it, and they brought them in there. So I don't want to end on, oh my God, it's terrible. It's really hard. There have been quite a few built. They're good. They've gotten some kind of government support for the most part. Rarely do they happen if they don't at this point in time. There's a weird contradiction we have, in our kind of thinking about electricity, where the government helped build the grid. It's really a socialized system that supports our electricity, production and distribution. Costs are socialized. But when we look at things like microgrids or even solar and storage, we have this attitude that no, government shouldn't spend anything on that, as though it's somehow a separate thing. It's still power. It's still something that's a vital service. And it's really a vital service when there's a big storm or a wildfire and you don't have it.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things happening in the U.S. is the growing importance of batteries. We have about 5 to 8 states that have good battery incentives. Illinois is now one of them with Surja. And they're not so focused on community microgrids. They're more focused on things like VPPs. And it's a step in the right direction. It is incentivizing front of the meter storage, behind the meter storage. And those batteries are going to be super useful in a variety of ways. And some of them will end up being part of microgrids, just not necessarily at the scale that I'm thinking. I guess it's baby steps, right? First solar, now batteries, and then maybe the next step. So maybe the next evolution of where the puck is going. And you've mentioned California repeatedly. It seems like California, of all the states, is most on the bleeding edge of these things. And then quickly thereafter, New York is a second runner, I would say. And then markets where there are a lot of natural disasters, like the Gulf Coast, are stepping up their game just out of sheer need, right? They're just getting black eye after black eye. And so they see the writing that they can avoid that with microgrids. And that's a big motivator. In our last few minutes, Alisa, do you want to make any other comments about, state levers, I guess, is a theme that I hear. And that's true for, the energy transition writ large right now, right? The federal government is backing away. So lean into the states where there's state action, be active in your state organization, and you can get a lot done at the state level.
Yeah, and I think it's also true you get a lot done at the city level or the town level or the county level. I think that one thing I think we've neglected as an industry is to talk more to the planners and spend more time with them so they can understand what's going on. They often just have a very vague idea about what a microgrid is, if they have any idea at all. So I think a lot of education on that side of things would really help tremendously. I recently did a podcast about Washington State. There's a company, Cascadia Renewables. You're probably familiar with them. They've done a lot of community microgrid building in Washington State. And what they say is that what's really needed is to go in and talk to a community and understand what it needs to win community support. Because it really starts there, right? If you have communities that are advocating for microgrids to their state officials or their federal officials, you got a lot better chance of having this thing all happen. And so, but what they found was that so often a developer will come in and say, oh, you know what, I've done the engineering studies and a microgrid would work right over here. Perfect, right? But they hadn't talked to the community. And like, as he put it, they don't realize that it's not the, fire station that's important. It's the clam shack, because that's where they get their food when there's power's out. So he goes in, they go in, Cascadia Renewables, and they actually talk to the community first and find out what their needs are. They talk to the disaster relief folks in the community and find out exactly what goes on when there's a disaster here. And then they cite based on that. And they're just finding that wins a lot of support from the bottom up. And I think that's what we need. Yes, we need federal funding. Yes, we need state funding. But I think we also have to need to think about the bottom up, about talking to these communities, about talking to, people who are influential in the community and educating them as well.
Hey guys, are you a residential solar installer doing light commercial, but wanting to scale into large C&I solar? I'm Tim Montague. I've developed over 150 megawatts of commercial solar, and I've solved the problem that you're having. You don't know what tools and technologies you need in order to successfully close 100 kW to megawatt scale projects. I've developed a commercial solar accelerator to help installers exactly like you. Just go to cleanpowerhour.com, click on strategy, and book a call today. It's totally free with no obligation. Thanks for being a listener. I really appreciate you listening to the pod. And I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Go to Clean Power Hour and click strategy today. Thanks so much. I think we'll leave it there. I want to thank Elisa Wood of Energy Changemakers for coming on the show today. More to come on solar batteries and microgrids here on the Clean Power Hour. Check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. Please tell a friend about the show. That's the best thing you can do to help others find this content. Alisa, how can our listeners find you?
You can find me at energychangemakers.com.
I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Thank you so much. The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more.